Thanks so much, Andrew, for that introduction, and thank you also to Business Advantage International for the invitation to speak. Bernard Salt, I'm the Managing Director of the Demographics Group these days. We provide business advice to business and government for Australia, Papua New Guinea and beyond, of course. My presentation today deals with worldwide social change. What I want to do is to actually lay out the landscape, the demographic landscape, provide a lens, if you like, on the countries, the economies, the markets that will shape Papua New Guinea's future, in fact. So it's from a demographic perspective that I'm hoping to anticipate what the 2020s might hold. And there's also some insight there, I think, for Australia as well, hopefully. I want to start by taking a big picture perspective and look at, in fact, the world population over 200 years. I'll get to Papua New Guinea and to Australia and the region in just a moment. This shows the number of people on the planet over 200 years. 1900 on the left, I'll show you through to the end of the 21st century on the right. Very simple chart, 2 billion people at Federation for Australia, up to about 7 billion today. And it raises the question of what will this look like by the end of the 21st century. The UN Department of Demography, the most authoritative demography group on the planet, has done this work. And they will say what the population will be at the end of the 21st century, and that's what it's expected to be. Australia will go from 25 million people to 43 million. I think it'll actually be a bit higher, 45, 46 or so. Papua New Guinea, 9 million today, up to 14 million into the future. But globally, we're going to go from 7 million people to 11 million people. Then the demographers think the world population will flatten out in the 22nd century. And it raises the question of what the world will look like over the next generation. What are the resources, what are the markets, what are the commodities that will be in hot demand, and which countries can leverage advantage out of that. That's the bigger picture perspective, because I think there is going to be a mad scramble over the next 2 generations for food, energy, water, resources, commodities, space, security, lifestyle, probably infrastructure, probably health, probably taxation, probably social welfare. You would say all of these things need to be delivered and managed for another 4 million people by the end of the millennials' lifetime. By the end of the 21st century is the point. So which countries on the planet would deliver food, energy, resources, commodities? Well, I would say that would be Papua New Guinea. I'd say it would be also Australia. We jointly have what the rest of the world will want in increasing quantities over the next generation. That makes us a valuable commodity. I think it makes us a vulnerable commodity. I'll come to that in just a moment, in fact. You can actually see the demand for agribusiness product in this very simple squiggly line. This is also sourced from the UN, and it shows world grain production: wheat, barley, rice, corn. And it shows on the top there on the right that there is 3,000 billion tonnes of grain harvested every year. It's not evenly distributed across 7 billion people, but 3,000 billion tonnes of grain, of course. And you say, well, back in 1960, that was world grain production, and it's increased like that, and that's the population increase like that. I wonder where grain production and demand must be when we get to 11 billion people, because I reckon it's got to be up there somewhere. That's all right, we'll just plant out all the unused arable land on the planet. Well, there is none. What does that do to a commodity like Australia, like Papua New Guinea? And there are a number of other agribusiness productive places. But it's not just agribusiness product, it is also energy and resources, security would be also valuable commodities going forward. This is where we need to steer both our countries, I would say, progressively over the next generation or so. Let's just park that for the time being and come with me on a big picture perspective and look at the world's most powerful economies. Who has the wherewithal to buy our stuff, whether it's gold and copper, tea, coffee, or iron ore or coal? Who has the wherewithal to be our leading markets? Go back 10 years. I'm a big fan of high altitude, long-term demographic perspectives. Here are the biggest economies on earth 10 years ago. There's America, of course, $14,000 billion in turnover. GDP, think of it as income, if you like. And there's Japan and China, both at about, let's say, a third of the US economy. I'll show you where they both are today and in 10 years' time. And there's Australia down at number 13. Papua New Guinea, of course, is right much lower, but that's not the point. The point here is the markets. Who has the capacity to buy the products that we are producing is the point. Well, let's move this forward to today, 2019. And there's the US, of course, $21,000 billion in GDP, in turnover. China is at what, 75% of the US economy? 10 years ago it was what, a third? I wonder where it will be in 10 years' time. I'll show you in 30 seconds. And then, of course, Japan. These are the markets. If I was selling Australian agribusiness product or commodities or resources, I would be looking at these markets. And in fact, you can see where we are. We've dropped to, we've been overtaken by South Korea, of course. 10 years' time, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has done an assessment. It's an assessment, of course, may not be correct. Here is the projection in 10 years' time. And China is now the largest economic force on the planet and in history in US dollars. Not purchase parity pricing, but in US dollars. In fact, there's the US and Japan. In fact, I will make the point that the three most important export markets to Papua New Guinea, China, Australia and Japan. These are important figures that set the agenda, set the capacity, the buying capacity. What we're going to do is to scope out the future of these countries and others and work out what that might be as an impact on the future of Papua New Guinea. In fact, very interesting to see that Australia actually overtakes the Russian Federation, a nuclear state, over that time frame, largely underpinned by our extraordinary rate of growth, 200,000 migrants per year. In the 1980s and 1990s, it was 100,000. We have doubled our rate of immigration. We are rich per capita. We're good customers. We can buy stuff. And we're going to continue to buy stuff for a generation into the future. I would be building those relationships, not just in terms of marketing, but in a business sense as well, in fact. Let's go further and look at divide the planet up into rich countries and developing countries. These are the blue countries are the richest countries on earth. This is where you take the GDP and you divide it by the population. It's very rough. The income per capita, the productive output per capita. And every one of those blue countries, the whole of Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, of course, South Korea, you'd find Singapore there as well. In fact, they're the richest countries on earth. The countries where you divide the GDP by the population, you get less than 10,000 US dollars per man, woman and child. It's not evenly distributed, of course. My point is that there are fault lines. I think there are fault lines that are never going to go away. They'll be there in 100 years' time, in fact. You might lessen the differences, perhaps, and I think that's certainly the case with China and Japan and South Korea as it becomes more middle class. The middle classification of China, of course, is the major economic, social, demographic shift of our time in history, in fact. And if you actually put some numbers against this, just in the next 20 years, by 2040, you'd say in one generation, Africa, the African continent, is going to add 531 million people. Europe is going to go backwards in population. You know, lift the pressure here, decrease the pressure there. There's going to be flows. There's issues here around tensions, geopolitical tensions that are going to surface, and you can see that on the north side of Australia. Let's go further and look at, just in a big picture, demographic, geopolitical perspective. There's Australia, there's Papua New Guinea, and I've identified all the colonial holdings, if you like, all the French bits and pieces, and the British bits and pieces. Australia, 25 million people. We're no bigger than the US state of Texas in population, but we claim an entire continent. Not even the Americans make such an outrageous claim, but we do, in fact. And we think that 2 slices of the Antarctic continent are ours too. In fact, Here is our land claim. 25 million, the only way 25 million people can claim the resources of an entire continent, plus a big chunk of another continent, all these other bits and pieces, is if you have the imprimatur of the prevailing world superpower. The Brits in the 19th century, the Americans in the 20th century. This is a very uncomfortable question for the Australians to actually look at, in fact, or consider. And if you look at how this is going to unfold, you can see a shift. China, of course, projecting its interests, of course, into the islands in the South China Sea, of course. And recently, just last year, there was an announcement about possible development of a base, a US PNG Australian base at Lombran. In fact, I used to make the case 10 years ago that Australia needed a military base on the northwest shelf, effectively to just assert sovereignty over the gas fields in the north. In fact, what you would actually do is actually leapfrog the whole lot and go to somewhere like Lombran. It sort of makes sense. Big picture, long-term demographic, geopolitical trends. This, not saying anything, I'm just mapping out the landscape. We'll get to what the implications are in just a moment. Let's just map out the landscape, see where everyone is. Let's move forward and look to the rising economic force, effectively of Asia. New figures were released by Fortune 500 1 week ago. Fortune 500 is like the old BRW magazine for Australia, I suppose, and they measure the 500 biggest corporate entities on earth by revenue, by market capitalisation. If you do it by market capitalisation, you don't really pick up the state-owned enterprises in China. So you do it by revenue. What are the biggest economic forces on the planet in a corporate sense? Where are they headquartered? Because I would be focusing on trade missions to those cities. In fact, that's where I would be going. 10 years ago, Tokyo arguably was the world's most powerful corporate city. 56 corporations in the 500 largest on the planet headquartered in Tokyo. They're still there, but 20 of them don't make the grade anymore because something has come in and just blasted everything out of the water. We'll come to that. There's Paris, London, New York. In fact, at that stage, Sydney had 3 and Melbourne had 3. Effectively the banks and Telstra, BHP, that's what you would have, but way, way down. In fact, 10 years later, of course, and you have Beijing, is arguably the largest corporate and most powerful corporate city on earth. It's not New York, it's not London, it's not Paris, it's not Hong Kong, it is actually Beijing, in fact. And you can actually see that the rising forces here are all in our zone, all in the zone that we want to do business with. As Australians, we want to do business with, and I would say that Papua New Guinea would want to do business with these corporations. Not necessarily to sell product into their domestic market, but to sell product into their supply chain is the way I would be looking at it. In fact, there has been a profound shift over the last decade, in fact, and nowhere is this better evidenced than a comparison between New York and Beijing. New York, arguably, the greatest city in the greatest economic force in history, up until the 2020s. You say, well, in 2006, New York had 21 head offices of the 500 largest on earth, and then 10 years later, it's down to 14, so you've lost 7. They're still there, they're just not making the grade, that's the point. Let's have a look at Beijing, and you've seen these figures broadly, so 12 up to 56, and they're largely state-owned enterprises, of course. State-owned enterprises need energy, resources, commodities. They need management, they need all of those resources, in fact, to deliver services over that time frame. Let's just look at one business in New York and one business in Beijing over this time frame. Verizon, which is a bit like a Telstra to Australians, I suppose, telecommunications company. I think it's the old Bell South, I'm quite sure. What is it? 2006, Verizon had a turnover of $75 billion US. 10 years later, it's 131. Imagine if you're on the board of Verizon, you think, pretty damn good time to be on the board of that business headquartered in New York. What a stellar result. 75% in 10 years. Good place, good industry, good time to be in business. Come with me to Beijing, to one business, State Grid. State Grid delivers electricity to more than 1 billion people that are buying stuff, electrical appliances. They kind of need power. And as a consequence, they had around, oh, that's interesting, 75 billion and 87 billion, same turnover 10 years ago. Imagine if you're on the board, not sure they have a board, State Grid, but here is the situation 10 years later. 10 years later, you are dealing with a different planet. It's like getting on a bucking bronco. So we Australians, we're going about our business, doing this and doing that, and everyone's going about, this is happening in our space. I would want to be doing business here. I'd be looking to do business here. Even it's down to providing office space. How do you actually manage something like that? Is it going to slow down? No, it's going to continue to grow. Here are opportunities for both our countries, I would say, going forward. Just in a pure economic sense, geopolitical issues put to one side, that's not my area. Let's move forward and look at, let's have a look at the 30 biggest cities in China. The biggest city is Shanghai, 26 million people. It's up from 14 million people at the turn of the century. What's that, 12 million people in 19 years? You divide 19 into 12 and you get about 750,000 people per year turning up in a city. They have a low birth rate. This is all rural to urban migration, in fact. And you think, well, you must need a whole lot of food, energy resources, commodity, copper, iron ore, coal, and actually to facilitate that. That's our role. That is Australia's role. I suggest that is Papua New Guinea's role, a role. Not the full story, but part of it, in fact. And then Beijing and Shenzhen and Chongqing and whatever go down to number 9. Wuhan, I'd never heard of Wuhan until I looked at this. A city of 9 million people in Wuhan. The reason why it's suddenly become important to me is that 5 years ago, Wuhan opened a direct air link into Coolangatta. That is not for the Gold Coasters to visit Wuhan. That is for the Wuhanis to have a holiday. Food, energy resources, commodity, space, security, holiday. Here are the opportunities. Here are the opportunities for Australia and for Papua New Guinea, in fact, through the middle classification of China. We need to invent a new word. We need to nick a word from German or somewhere like that that means middle classification, that requires electric power, that drives something like State Grid, that can be a customer, if you like. And that also manifests in a range of demand for other products and services. Coffee, tea, for example, would be a driving force. Tourism, for example, would be a driving force over that time frame. When you look at the top 30 cities in China, one of them has a direct air link into Papua New Guinea. I thought this was interesting because I've been tracking this list and their connections into Australian cities since 2004. In 2004, there was one direct air link between any Australian city and any Chinese city, and it was from Sydney to Hong Kong. You could fly direct from Sydney to Hong Kong in 2004. Today you can fly from Sydney to 17 cities. There is a new city opened up every year, and I would expect this to happen over the next 10 years or so. It'll be Hong Kong, then Shanghai, then Chengdu, then Chongqing, you would expect. Greater connectivity is a sign of integration, if you like, dependency, and opportunity, you would say, going forward. Let's take this further and look at where those flights are. So it's 9 international destinations, I think it is, from Port Moresby. Sydney has 60, Melbourne has 50. Before we colonials get too far ahead of ourselves, if you go to London, London connects with 360 global cities. It is the most connected city on the planet. So Sydney's about 1/5 of London, and then Port Moresby 9. But I think in time you would see greater connectivity into second, third tier cities in China, perhaps even to the west coast of the US, perhaps even into New Zealand in due course, is the way I would see it. Airports. would be business to be in, generally, I would say. Let's go further and look at what I see as the Asian diaspora across the Pacific. And this is Asian including Indian. And if you go to the censuses of the US, of Canada, of New Zealand and Australia, you can actually see something quite interesting. Go to somewhere like Vancouver, it's a bit bigger than, it's about the same size as Adelaide, I suppose, as Brisbane, I suppose. 41% of the Vancouverian population has an Asian heritage, in fact. You can actually see this spreading out, in fact. And it's the middle classification, looking for lifestyle. Same in San Francisco and Auckland. In fact, Sydney's about 20%, Melbourne at 7%, Brisbane not quite as much. I don't know what that figure is in Port Moresby, but I would say that these Asian values is what we're going to see, and Asian preferences. Maybe more tea as opposed to coffee, you might say, over time. It's very interesting. The Australians shifted from tea to coffee by the Mediterraneans, the Greeks, the Italians. We also started to kiss each other on the cheek, and very, very sophisticated. I think that we might see a shift back, the great beverage shift in the 2020s, as more Asian values start to shift our demand, our consumer demand. In which case, we'd be saying to P&G, we want your tea more than we want your coffee. We'll probably have both, in fact, over that time frame. But I would see that possibly also surfacing on the west coast of the US. Here is the Png Economy over time. Big picture, high altitude, broad brush demographic trends. 1960 on the left, and you can see an explosion from 2005-6 or so, at about $25 billion. US, of course, in its GDP, compared to the Australian economy, about 1,500. In fact, I don't know what the times that is, but you get a sense of the proportionality. I see that it's rising, is the point, which is positive. How do you manage that? What is the projection? What is the trajectory going forward? Here is, very again, high altitude, broad brush demographics. Here is where you arguably, Papua New Guinea makes its money. It sells product, yes, extractive gold and copper, and gas, and agribusiness, tea, coffee, fisheries, of course, which were mentioned previously. And you can see the value in US dollars. This is the last 12 months, of course. But what I found particularly interesting is when you convert that into countries. Which countries buy most stuff from Papua New Guinea and pay them money that they can then use to invest in infrastructure? It's a key relationship when you think about it. Well, there's three. And Australia, of course, is number one. Well, not quite number one. You'd say about a quarter of the value of PNG exports are sold to Australia, another quarter to China, and 21% to Japan, and other bits and pieces throughout Southeast Asia. I felt it was quite interesting that the US wasn't there, at this stage at least, and also felt it was interesting that the Netherlands and Germany are there from Europe, which are the former colonial powers, of course, for Indonesia, with Papua West, and also the New Guinea element, of course. Those ties going on for decades into the future. But you would say, well, they're the three most important markets, Japan, China and Australia. What are the demographics? What are the future of those countries? Are they going to want more stuff from Papua New Guinea over the next 10, 15 years? Very simple proposition. Let's have a look. Here's Australia, of course. This chart shows over 100 years the number of people added to the 15 to 64 demographic. 15 to 64-year-olds buy consumer goods, they take out loans, they reproduce and they pay tax. This is the gut, the engine, the piston that drives any economy. You want lots and lots of people in the productive consumption, tax-paying stage in the life cycle. And if you can grow that through immigration, well, then you've got a great thing happening. That's what the Australians have done. And you see, well, this is like 100,000 people per year, 100,000 people per year. Oops, we're up at about 200,000 people per year. The official forecasts have it going down, of course, into the future. But I say there's continued strong growth. We're a good bet. PNG, snuggle up to the Australians because they're going to buy your stuff for 2 generations into the future, is the point of this chart and say, well, that's the Australians taken care of. What about the Japanese? I think it's the Japanese. It's the same chart. 1950 on the left, 2050 on the right. This is the net growth or contraction, 1 year on the next, on the working age population, 15 to 64-year-olds. And you can see about 1 million people per year. After the war, the 50s, the 60s, Japan is absolutely booming, a consumption heartland at a global level, to the point that it produces 56 global businesses headquartered in Tokyo that deliver consumer goods across the planet, in fact. And then it's a wall in 1993. And all of a sudden, more people start to exit the workforce than enter the workforce. And of course, it was a collapse in the birth rate in the 1960s. Comes back to impact them 10, 15, 20, and ain't going to change. The big picture thing, yeah, okay, I get it, that Japan actually has global businesses that we can feed stuff into their supply chain. But in actual fact, their population base is shrinking from 127 million to, in fact, by the end of this, around about 110 million. So it would be selling into the global corporates headquartered in Japan rather than into the domestic market, because the domestic market is actually going to slow down into the future. You can't get around that. There's no denying the demographics. That's all very interesting. So there's a bit of a caution there, a bit of a strategic direction into the corporates as opposed to the domestic market. For the Australians, well, we've only got 7 businesses in the global 500. 4 of them are banks. So really it's the domestic market that's growing. That's what you'd be focusing on. Certainly the tea, the coffee, maybe the copper, perhaps. Well, that's Australia, that's Japan. What about China? And you can see the China growth in the working age population absolutely skyrockets back here. Lots and lots of people pushing into this stage of the life cycle means you've got a lot of people competing for labour. I'll sell my labour for $1 a day. And it becomes a manufacturing heartland, hub, if you like. Cheap labour. And then, actually from now, forever, it starts to contract off an incredibly high base. There's almost 1 billion people sitting here. So just through the rural to urban migration, you could still grow this market. But at a high level, it's contracting, and say, well, if the labour market is not growing at this rate, then the value of labour shifts. In fact, employers start to compete. So the value of labour goes from $1 a day to $2, $3, $4 a day. It suddenly ceases to become the cheap heartland in the 2020s, 2030s. What business wants is, well, we need a cheap place across the planet to actually produce stuff. Is that going to be Bangladesh? Is it going to be the Philippines? Is it going to be Thailand? Is it going to be Vietnam? I don't know, whatever it is. But we need to be aware of that so that we can sell our stuff. I'm speaking to the Australians and to the Papua New Guineans. We want to make sure that we're ready, that we're anticipating. We know which way this is going to flex, that way or that way, where we need to be selling our product so that we can navigate what we all want, which is the best, most safe, secure, prosperous future for that next generation of Australians and Papua New Guineans. Let's look further and look at Australia's, forget the demographics, I think this is the key chart driving Australian consumption. It shows quarter by quarter from 1962 on the left through to January of 2019 on the right. It shows GDP growth and contraction. Where you have 2 negative quarters together, you have a recession. Let's just read the last 60 years of economic history in Australia together. Your working life, maybe even your entire life, is stretched out across these bars. Let's read this together. So from 1961, when Bob Menzies was the Prime Minister, we had growth, then recession, then growth, then recession, then growth, then recession, then growth, 25 years. If you had a choice to be a 25-year-old going into the workforce for the first time in any year of the last 200 years of Australian history, what year would you want to be 25? Because I would choose that year. I would not have 12% unemployment behind me in the December, that's March 1993, but I'd have 25 years of economic prosperity ahead of me. Imagine trying to sell product to people back in the 1960s. These are people that fought in the Second World War. These are people that remember the Great Depression. Don't trust credit. Don't get into debt. Don't get too uppity. Don't get too ahead of yourself. You know these people because they are your parents, in fact. Whereas today, 25 years of economic prosperity, you get to this time in history, our time in history, and we have forgotten what a recession looks like. We think an unemployment rate with a 6 in front of it is outrageous. No, it can have a 12 in front of it, in fact. And I think that it also has lifted the bar of expectation, of entitlement, of aspiration. Outrageous aspiration, in fact. We are no longer happy with a caravan holiday to the Coolangatta Caravan Park. We want a Jetstar holiday to Bali, in fact. We've upped the ante. Why would that not also be a scuba holiday? Diving to, I don't know, the Bismarck Archipelago, is it, or whatever it is. I think there are opportunities there. With the outrageous expectation, lifestyle, cafes, bars, restaurants, coffee, tea, avocado too, I am told, apparently. So again, you can see that the demographics and the culture of expectation, of spending, of consumption, you would say, you know, Australia's a pretty good bet from that point of view. Yes, the other countries certainly driving important, but you would have to say, if that was to continue, very positive. Let's just have a look at a fundamental shift in the way in which life is lived, certainly in the Western world, Australia, and I've actually put China here as well. If you go back 80 years to look at life expectancy in Australia in 1939. In 1939, the average Australian lived for 63 years. You qualified for the age pension at 65, so you promptly dropped dead 2 years before you got a pension. Back in 1939, there were no children, no teenagers in 1930. You're a child for 14 years, then you're an adult, and you're an old person at 51 or 52. If you were 50 years old and unhappy in your relationship in 1939, you'd think, you know, what's the point? I'm going to be dead in 10 years' time. I might just wait this out. Whereas baby boomers have another 30 years of life. There's a lifestyle stage of the life cycle that is in production right now. What do you do with it? How can we sell our product, our service, our country, our economy into that market is the question. 40 years later, life expectancy is now 74. That is 5 years. What is that? 9 years. 9 years in retirement. The teenager makes their appearance, and you're now not old until into your 60s. 40 years later, life expectancy is in fact 83. 17 years in retirement. Although the most common age for retirement for an Australian is not 65, it's 58. That is 24 years in retirement. What are you going to do? Sit at home and babysit grandkids for 24 years? Baby boomers will not do that. I think they'll working 5 days, 4 days, 3 days, 2 days, 1 day per week, and then downshift, downsize, move up the coast, down the coast, take cruises, be more inclined to lifestyle. What is a competitor to Bali, to Phuket, to Fiji, on the north side of Australia? What would you say? Is that an opportunity? Can we position a business into that market of 5 million people coming into that stage in the life cycle in the 2020s and beyond, you would say? And also, I've shown the life expectancy in China with the greater middle classification of China. Of course, you can see closing the gap with Australia, not quite with Japan as yet. Japan is even older, in fact. But again, this creates this culture of lifestyle, of expectation. What are the commodities? What are the resources? What are the services that Papua New Guinea, and to be fair, Australia, can actually deliver into this market going forward, in fact? And just a couple more slides. I wanted to show you where growth and opportunity and prosperity lies in Australia. And then I'll show you Japan in just a moment. So this is 1/4 of the export value of Papua New Guinea, incredibly important to Papua New Guinea, the performance of the Australian economy. Between May 2000 and May 2019, the number of jobs added to the Australian continent, 4.3 million. Good jobs, bad jobs, full-time, part-time. I'm interested in high-altitude, broad-brush demographics. We lost 255,000 jobs. So Alcoa closes in Geelong, it's 1,000 jobs. Queensland Nickel closes in towns, that's 250 jobs. But does that mean in net terms, in 19 years, we have added 4 million jobs? That is actually correct. We've gone from 8 million workers to 12 million workers, underpinned by this outrageous level of immigration, you would say, double the level in the 80s and 90s, driving immigration, driving prosperity, pushing our GDP up, creating wealth, creating tax, creating a culture of consumption. Enter Papua New Guinea and others to supply. You would say, well, where are the jobs? Who's got the jobs? Because I want to sell them stuff. You say, well, it's up here. Healthcare and social assistance, so 4 million jobs, 900,000. It's not quite a quarter, is it? Jobs in healthcare and social assistance, professional services, construction, education. Never look at the numbers. Numbers are boring. The Australian people are talking to you through this chart, and they're telling you about prosperity. What is the common denominator between the bars on the left-hand side of the chart? Because I would say, in order to share in the prosperity of modern Australia, you need either a university degree or technical training. These are knowledge workers, city-based knowledge workers that have a particular consumption pattern, expectation, lifestyle expectation, and that's where the opportunity would lie for Papua New Guinea to sell products, sell services. I would also say that this leads to expertise that could be sold into or delivered into or transferred into Papua New Guinea in healthcare, professional services, in fact, construction and education, in fact. Let's compare this is for Australia, with that other great market of Papua New Guinea, and that is Japan. Here are the same figures for Japan. This is from May 2000 to May 2019. The figures are not quite the same years, so it's 2005 to 2018. You can't get the numbers exactly right. But here is an economy with 60 million workers. Australia has 12, 13 million workers. So it's several times bigger than Australia. And it's the last 10 years or so. So Japan has added 5.2 million jobs. It's lost 2.3 million jobs. It's created a net 2.9 million jobs in about 11 years. Still growing, still prosperous, still being able to buy stuff. Well, where are the jobs in Japan? What are the commodities, the services, the resources that might be required by Papua New Guinea or Australia? Well, it ain't no coincidence. I've actually done this chart for Australia, for Canada, for the US, for New Zealand, for Japan, for France and Germany. The number one is always healthcare. The entire planet in the developed world is shifting towards healthcare, is the point. Whether it's right or wrong or good or bad is not the point. In fact, so if you're in Japan, you want to be in that space, and you say, well, actually, a lot of this is going backwards in the Japanese economy, but they have 56 or whatever it is, global businesses headquartered in Tokyo alone. So really they're reducing their exposure to their local economy and increasing their exposure to a global economy. It's a smart thing to do, I suppose. So your business, Papua New Guinea, is to sell stuff into the supply chain of the big corporates in Japan. In Australia, it's to sell stuff into the domestic market, is the point. That's what's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. That's going to give you the biggest and deepest pool of spending capacity for what you have to sell going forward, is the point. That could actually be done for a number of countries to work out where you need to be focused, of course. And of course, that leads to my conclusion that it is principally Australia, China, Japan. And of course, there is that geopolitical issue which needs to be managed by experts in that field. That's not my field, of course. Then, of course, 70%, if you look at the value of exports out of Papua New Guinea, going into 3 countries over that time frame. And I say there's going to be a fundamental shift in consumer behaviour with Japan contracting and ageing, China ageing over that time frame, and Australia remaining on course. High levels of growth, high levels of expectation and entitlement as to how we expect to live going forward. Here's where I would be building strong relationships going into the future, of course. It may well be that trading blocks emerge, if you think over the 10, 20 years or so, but every country needs to navigate around those, I suppose. And of course, if you're thinking in the development of Papua New Guinea, then key infrastructure, certainly education services. And of course, it's how you respond to those shifts and having that big picture blueprint of the future. Sketch it all out. The big picture geopolitical shifts, the big picture economic shifts, the big picture corporate shifts, the big picture demographic shifts in your key market, and synthesise it down, say, what does that mean? Because I say there is a specific strategy that will deliver the best outcome for Papua New Guinea going forward. I think the points that were made previously were absolutely right. Geologically blessed is this island, in fact. How can we leverage that? How can we deliver the best possible outcome for the prosperity, security and quality of life of the next generation of Papua New Guineans? Thank you very much.